Hello, everybody. I'm Nigel Layton, the Global Head of Pharma and Life Sciences for Forvis Mazars. Welcome to our Growing Global Life Sciences webinar. This will last around 45 minutes and we'll have a Q&A session at the end. And please submit your questions using the chat function. The webinar will be recorded and we will circulate that afterwards. So without further ado, I'm going to get on, and I think the team will introduce themselves. So, Simon,
Good morning, everyone. Simon Withington, Head of Technology Consulting for Forvis Mazars in the UK.
Alice,
Good morning, everyone. Alice Stevens, Director of Sustainability, based in the UK.
Jim,
Morning, everyone. So I'm Jim McDevitt. I'm a corporate tax partner here based in London, focusing on our very large organizations in the life sciences and pharmaceutical sector.
and I'm going to introduce George, who is our economist, resident economist, and there's no better person to have on the webinar than George in this time of global uncertainty and political turbulence and all these events affecting the industry. So without further ado, George, if you could give us a perspective on how this affects the industry, be really, really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. Hi, I'm George Lagarius. I am the chief economist at Forvis Mazar. Let's talk about first of all, don't worry, this isn't going to be a death by PowerPoint. Let's talk about what is happening in the world and how it's impacting the pharma industry. So our 3Ds are our key model of understanding the world. There's debt, disruption, and deregulation. Debt is the most important factor. Why? Because since the 1980s, societies aren't really having many kids anymore. Okay, and usually you grow your economy by having more kids. We have the other way to grow your economy is to increase productivity, but productivity hasn't really been increasing, and we're not really getting the benefits of the fourth industrial revolution in terms of productivity yet, the AI revolution. So you can really grow your economy by incurring debt and deregulating, which is cutting the red tape. And that's precisely what we have been doing. We have been increasing debt and deregulating since the 1980s. Now, deregulation cycles, there was a regulation cycle after 2008, the global financial crisis, but debt accumulation has increased throughout the past 40 years. And guess what? We're out of fiscal space. We can't borrow anymore to fund our societies, which is why you see such turnover in top political positions, because countries and governments can't deliver to their voters what they said they would deliver. And because of that, you get disruption. You get people who say, oh, I'm going to change the systems, shake it up, blah, blah, blah. They come up with a new solution. And it's becoming a lot more competitive because an international agreement is no longer the basis for growth. Growth has become so scarce, it's become a competitive item. That's why you get disruption. Okay, now how does this all fit into the pharma industry? Well, look at it in various items, especially the ones relating to the US. So, for example, look at it in terms of trade wars. Mr. Trump competes for growth with Europe, which is an easier opponent to compete with because they're a junior partner to the coalition, which is another way of saying that they're slightly more easily bullied. He has launched various trade wars and pharma tariffs, and he's also launched trade probes, especially against Germany over what they called persistent underpayment for innovative pharmaceutical products. So they specifically focused on the pharma industry. Going back to our way of looking at the world, this is not going away anytime soon, okay? And I want to be clear about this. These are not the rants of the person who happens to occupy the White House. This is a more steady theme of disruption. And it's not going to go away, I think, even if there is a change in the US presidency. Okay. And obviously, this is having now a knock-on effect on various other European pharmaceuticals. Are there other geopolitical issues, economic issues that pressure the pharma industry? Yes. Supply chains and input cost pressures. India's pharma sector, for example, faces significant exposure to the Strait of Hormuz, and cargo rates have surged 200 to 350% for some routes. So as you would know, possibly better than I do, to create a pharmaceutical product, you need inputs from many countries. And what you need to have those inputs is international cooperation to get from country A to country B to country C to country D, where the final product is distributed. Okay, now in this environment, this is going to become, and it is becoming, exponentially more difficult. It's not just a question of resilience anymore, just sticking with it until it blows over. It's a question of designing strategies to make companies more agile. So it's resilience on the balance sheet, it's resilience on the operation, it's being agile on the operational side, which of course costs money as well. And these are the big decisions now CFOs of pharma companies are being forced to make. Back to our third theme, deregulation. And disruption, two themes, in fact. The FDA leadership and stability. The new FDA, the American regulator organization, the Federal Drug Administration, will now be led by a lawyer called Kyle Diamantas, who has taken over in an acting capacity already. And that has caused a lot of departures from the agency. So now, because the government resources are more constrained, there can potentially be delays in regulatory submissions and possibly adverse effect on drug development timelines. These are all part of the same picture of disruption, regulation, deregulation. Are other issues important for geoeconomic issues important for the pharma industry? Well, the good news is that we have seen debt become a little bit well, not easier to obtain. We're seeing valuations of companies lower, and that helps M&A. Because there are two types of M&A cycles. One, the peak M&A happens at the top of an economic cycle, at the bottom of an economic cycle, and especially in fixed income markets, that's sort of where we are. So 2016, we have seen a surge in deal making. We saw GSK and Nuvalent, a $10 billion deal. We saw Gillette and Arcelex at $8 billion, and so on and so forth. It's being driven by the need to replenish pipelines ahead of patent cliffs. Finally, there is China. So as we compete for growth, China also competes for growth. And because they have this huge manufacturing capacity, they're the world's cheap manufacturer, they can really increase the competitive pressure. China's innovation capacity is creating rising competitive pressures on any company that's not China. Okay, and we see this a lot in licensing deals involving Chinese biotechs. So this is how the world, shaped by debt, disruption, and deregulation, is sort of affecting the pharma industry.
Thank
And
you.
with this, I think I can yield the floor back to Nigel.
Yeah, thank you, George. Yeah, it's a fascinating scene setting for the webinar, so thank you. Really, really interesting. I think the next issue we come to is technology, which is, at the forefront of all our minds as we grow our businesses, and technology will be at the center of all business activity for the next foreseeable future. So, Simon, um, how critical is technology in enabling international life sciences supply chains today?
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. I mean, put simply, it's now fundamental, so it's not optional. It's fair to say life science supply chains are now some of the most complex in any sector. They span multiple countries, regulators, suppliers, logistics partners, and they often involve highly sensitive products like vaccines. They must be handled under very precise conditions. Technology is what makes all of that complexity manageable. And I probably see that in four key ways. Firstly, it enables that end-to-end visibility. So digital platforms and integrated data give organizations those real-time insights into where products are, how they're moving, whether there are risks emerging anywhere in the network. And that's well beyond just tier one suppliers as well. It's all the way through to nth party providers. Secondly, it underpins that regulatory compliance and patient safety. So obviously in the sector, you can't operate internationally without robust traceability. So technologies like serialization, digital tracking ensure every product can be traced from manufacturer through to patient, which is now a regulatory requirement in most of the markets that we operate in. Third, it drives resilience. And I guess, as George was mentioning earlier, we're in an increasingly volatile world with things like geopolitical disruption, tariffs, supply shocks. They're becoming the norm. So organizations, they need to anticipate and respond quickly. So advanced analytics and moving on to AI is allowing companies to forecast demand more accurately. They can model disruption scenarios and adapt operations in real time. And finally, I think we're seeing through our research the key technology enablers for international growth. So it's scaling supply chains effectively, very critical to entering new markets in particular, depends heavily on having the right digital infrastructure, data foundations, integrated systems in place. So I would say that technology is no longer just supporting the supply chain, it's actually the backbone of global life science operations.
Great, thank you. And what are the common technology challenges when companies are scaling across markets, and how do organizations navigate these?
Yeah, there's quite a few challenges, but I'll maybe pick on three or four. I think the first one I'll mention is legacy and fragmented systems. Many organizations are trying to scale globally on top of maybe regional or local ERP systems and disconnected tools. It makes it very difficult to get a consistent view of operations or respond quickly to disruption. Modernization of core systems, integration of data is often the first priority, I'd say, when trying to scale internationally. And then in lockstep with that, the second area is probably data standardization and data architecture and quality. So when operating across multiple markets, organizations are dealing with different data formats, regulatory requirements, reporting standards. Without a strong, consistent data foundation, it becomes quite hard to support forecasting, compliance, performance management at a global level. And then the third kind of want to touch on is probably the regulatory and compliance complexity. So life science supply chains have very different rules by country, from product traceability requirements to data integrity. So technology needs to adapt to those local requirements while still maintaining that global consistency. So there's a balance which is often quite difficult to achieve, particularly when expanding quickly. And the fourth one, which is maybe not talked about quite as much, is probably around skills and capability of individuals and colleagues. So even where organizations are investing in advanced technologies like AI, many struggle to realize the value because it's low adoption, there isn't alignment across the business in terms of what ROI looks like, and there's also poor integration across the organization. So we see that as quite a large barrier to being able to leverage technology effectively. In terms of, I guess, solutions, I guess three things that I would say, and it's pretty linked to the sequence that I mentioned before. The first is to look to sort of simplify and standardize the core. So that means trying to move away from fragmented local systems towards more integrated and scalable platforms, typically supported by a really clear global data model. And then linked to that is then investing in strong data foundations. So ensuring there's robust governance in place, quality controls, interoperability across data sources. So the data can be trusted and used consistently across the markets. And finally, taking an ecosystem approach to technology. So rather than looking to build everything locally, there's a greater opportunity to create connected digital ecosystems. So that allows you to plug in to different capabilities and markets quickly using sort of APIs, and that allows access to more suppliers, partners, regulated data, and really providing that single view of the supply chain.
Great. And the biggest opportunities, AI, data automation, for technology in the sector, what would you say the main ones are here?
Yeah, potential opportunities are huge, and I guess George alluded to the kind of AI revolution that we're still in the early stages of. But I think the first thing I'd say is that kind of AI-driven planning and forecasting. So it's probably the most mature and immediately valuable use case, actually. So organizations are using AI and advanced analytics to improve things like demand forecasting, optimize inventory, run pretty complex what-if scenarios. And we're already seeing the impact of that. And they can be quite significant. So better service levels, lower stock outs, reduced working capital. So really seeing some tangible benefits there. Second is probably around the automation of compliance and regulatory tracking. So again, given the complexity of global regulation, starting to see Gen AI in particular to scan regulatory changes, identify potential compliance gaps, propose actions as well in real time. So rather than taking a reactive approach to compliance, there's a I guess ability to engage in continuous compliance monitoring. You're moving away from kind of manual people-led to that automated approach, which is hugely valuable because you can operate any remediation in real time. And then the third is probably that, again, the end-to-end visibility and through that data and digital integration. So connected data sources across the supply chain. So organizations bring together data from suppliers, manufacturing, logistics, and customers. They can move towards a kind of a true control tower model where you've got that single view of the end-to-end supply chain. It enables your real-time decision making, faster response to disruption, better risk management, maybe responding to some of the things that George talked about around pricing shocks, and responding to those in a faster and more efficient way. And then probably the last thing I'd mention looking ahead, and many organizations are already in the early stages of this, but the use of agentic AI, particularly in workflow automation and in task automation. So moving from tasks that were potentially executed manually to more autonomous agent-led delivery of tasks, reducing that kind of heavy manual effort and freeing up people to make more strategic decisions based on the insights and the outcomes rather than focusing on the inputs and the tasks themselves.
Great. And Simon, you mentioned obviously that AI is crucial in these times. It comes also with risk, though, AI. And how are pharma and life sciences organizations mitigating these risks to ensure accurate and productive data?
Yeah, and I guess just sort of touching on those risks, there's probably three I'd highlight. The first is that data risk. So the AI is only as good as the data that sits behind it. So poor data quality or fragmented data can lead to things like inaccurate forecasts, bad decisions that are driven by the AI, and ultimately can lead to supply chain disruption. The second is that kind of transparency and trust layer. So highly regulated sector, the organizations need to be able to explain how decisions are being made, particularly where AI is influencing the supply, quality, or compliance. So that lack of transparency can create regulatory and reputational risk as well. And the third is in the kind of the operational and cyber risk. So as the supply chains become more connected through not just AI, but also IoT, so Internet of Things and automation, the attack surface actually increases, and the cyber threats evolve. And a failure or a breach in that digital supply chain can have significant real world consequences. You've seen recent cyber attack of Novo Nordisk recently. That wasn't kind of an AI led attack, but it shows that the threat landscape is real, and these organizations are targets. I think in terms of some mitigation steps that can be taken. I think, again, it is talking about those data foundations, so making sure that the data quality, governance, standardization is there, and that's going to allow you to really scale, utilize AI effectively, and you won't have some of the issues around quality, around confidence in the AI outcomes. The second is probably then to embed AI governance from day one. So having clear ownership and the right risk and control framework in terms of how AI is developed, deployed and monitored. In particular, being really clear on where human in the loop comes in over the top of AI decisions, and making sure that that's proportionate so you can leverage the benefits while making sure there's the right level of accountability and oversight. And it's absolutely key to supporting that decision making, ensuring that there is the right level of accountability. And I think probably the last thing I'd say is organizations really need to focus in on the specific use cases without trying to transform everything at once using AI. So you're prioritizing high value use cases, some of which we talked about earlier, like forecasting, compliance monitoring. You deliver some tangible wins and then move on to perhaps some of the more complex AI use cases once there's confidence and the governance model in place that's going to maintain a robust framework.
Thank you, Simon. Really, really good insights. Thank you very much. ESG and sustainability is a key issue in pharma and life sciences as well, and taken very seriously by all companies in the industry. So, Alice, I wonder, as pharma companies are expanding into new markets, what specific regulations should they be considering in relation to their supply chains?
Thanks, Nigel. Well, it's a relatively complex question because the sustainability regulatory landscape is complex and evolving all the time. But I think, expansion into new markets brings different localized requirements, obviously, and those need to be thoroughly scoped as part of broader due diligence. The requirements obviously will range from local environmental regulations and permitting, differing labour standards, which need to be taken into account, in particular in the relation to how kind of group level policies need to be implemented at the local level. And then, of course, there'll be local requirements on sustainability disclosure. Another factor when expanding is also taking into account local cultural differences, and this is something that I think often organisations don't take into account. But fundamentally, cultural differences do affect how standard operating systems and procedures work in practice, particularly in organisations where, from a governance perspective, you rely quite heavily on codes of conduct, on whistleblowing, and you need to take into account cultural differences in terms of how people will show up and will work within those operating procedures. From a broader supply chain perspective, pharma is a highly regulated industry. There's nothing new there, of course, but pharma companies are increasingly needing to manage additional sustainability-related regulations across the whole value chain, including in that upstream value chain, where it comes to human rights due diligence and environmental due diligence itself. There is a new landscape of human rights and environmental legislation, and organisations need to account for that across their value chains and in the operating procedures that they implement through the value chains. For some large companies, there's obviously the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which together with forced labour import bans place new pressure on value chain visibility and due diligence mechanisms. Both of those are pan-European regulation, and many companies think of these types of regulations as being very much Western. But actually, there's a movement in Southeast Asia to introduce mandatory due diligence obligations also. So Thailand and Indonesia are examples of two jurisdictions which are in the process of introducing these legislations. At the same time as that, and contradictory to the human rights and environmental due diligence obligations, China has recently introduced new supply chain regulations, so number 834 and 835. These work in direct competition to Western due diligence requirements, and the new laws mean that human rights due diligence activities which are required under forced labour prevention acts and various extraterritorial due diligence requirements, can now be framed in China as discriminatory interference and subject to litigation and other measures. This places additional tensions on supply chain due diligence as companies will need to navigate these contradictory requirements in order to operate in these different jurisdictions. So this landscape of regulatory fragmentation creates complexity in sourcing and compliance, as well as in expansion. And getting ahead of that is vital to prevent disruption through supply continuity risks.
Thank you. And how can pharma companies actually balance their own sustainability ambitions with maintaining supply chain security, particularly again when expanding globally?
Yeah, I mean, I think, from a strategic sustainability point of view, there has been in the last of year and a half, a message of deregulation, right? So we have kind of political messaging that perhaps climate change isn't happening, for example, which many of us, I'm sure, working in this space and more broadly would argue quite strongly against. Also, we've seen the EU's omnibus regulation, which essentially drew back some of the requirements under the European Green Deal. And I think that's led to some boards taking the option to treat sustainability as a compliance-only approach. However, I think this risks oversimplifying the requirements of sustainability. And what it also does is it layers a cost burden for that compliance and that complexity of the different regulations globally into the organization. And it also means if you take a compliance only lens, that you potentially don't benefit from some of the principles that sustainability is trying to introduce, which actually help with resilience. So sustainability, as everybody knows, is an integral part of value chain management. It's interwoven with other value chain tensions and part of a broader landscape of resilience. Ultimately, the identification of sustainability related impacts, risks, and opportunities is a process through which organizations can identify and link sustainability related issues to business value and resilience. Companies that have mature systems in place to identify risk and opportunity, to conduct due diligence and ensure data transparency are likely to benefit from decreased regulatory and litigation risk. The technologies that Simon mentioned that are being utilized for tracking medicines through their manufacture can also benefit companies to meet sustainability requirements in terms of visibility and strengthened supplier relationships. And often, I think, and historically, the risks that companies manage through value chains tend to be seen as distinct and siloed. But actually, if you can unite the different requirements across your technology, for example, and then into the sustainability requirements that you need to manage through your value chain, you can actually be far more strategic and robust in the way that you manage the value chain opportunities and indeed risks. It's also true, I think, that in terms of implementation of sustainability targets, they can lead to short-term disruption where the roadmap to attain those targets hasn't necessarily been considered properly over the long term. So when changes that are driven by targets affect suppliers, materials, or processes, an organization really needs to take time to consider what that roadmap looks like and how the pace should be set in order to not lead to disruption in terms of the delivery of the target itself. An example, obviously, is in relation to decarbonisation. To meet decarbonisation targets, organisations need to engage directly with suppliers. This engagement and relationship development can provide other benefits in terms of resilience and broader risk visibility by strengthening those relationships on those key business partners operating within the value chain. Ultimately, keeping pace with sustainability strategies or keeping sustainability strategies in place is the recommendation, in part because this will enable companies to meet, or pharma companies to meet, compliance requirements, but it will also enable more resilience to supply chain disruption, better capacity to deal with the evolving regulatory landscape. And frankly, that evolving regulatory landscape, despite the message of deregulation, is actually not slowing down. more and more countries are introducing sustainability regulations that pharmaceutical companies need to navigate and account for within the different jurisdictions that they are operating and securing their supply from.
Thank you, Alice. That was fascinating, particularly as many of my clients have such a big operations in China that your comments on China were particularly interesting. So thank you. Um, I don't think we can talk about growth without considering the tax implications of growth and how we can minimize the tax burdens and plan effectively. So, Jim, when life sciences business are expanding internationally today, how's the role of tax changed compared with, say, 10 years ago?
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. So tax has moved from being sort of one of a sort of key driver of structural or geographical organization or design to becoming one of several strategic considerations that need to work together. So if we were to go back 10 or 15 years, many pharmaceutical businesses were operating in a world where IP, intellectual property, was highly mobile. So companies could separate where products were developed, where they were manufactured, and where profits were ultimately recognized and taxed. Tax planning was often focused around the ownership of patents, know-hows, and other IP and intangible assets for this very purpose. Now, over time, that's changed quite significantly. So it started really with the OECD BEPS initiative that was introduced, and the idea of that was that profits should align more closely with economic activity and value creation. So the focus shifted to where people were actually sitting, where strategic decisions were being made, and where R&D was genuinely being undertaken. So that's sort of where it started. And then that trend sort of accelerated again through US tax reform, and then again with Pillar 2 and the global minimum tax framework that's now in place. And it's actually a key deadline for many countries today on that, but that's not for now. But what I find sort of particularly interesting is that the questions that companies are sort of asking or pondering today, they're very different than the question of a decade ago or sort of 5 to 10 years ago. So I think historically, the discussion has often been around where should profits sit, how do we optimize our effective tax rate, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas today, the discussion is much more likely to be where should we invest, where should we build, where should we sit our scientists, where should the manufacturing take place. And for tax, that's an important distinction because it reflects a broader change in how boards think, how boards think about sort of value creation and how decisions are made. Increasingly, resilience, access to talent, speed to market, and geopolitical risk and sort of supply chain security are influencing sort of these structural and geographical operating models just as much as tax, if not, I would say today, more so than tax. So it's not that tax has become less important, but it's become much more integrated into a much broader discussion around overall business strategy in this sector. So some of the more successful organizations are no longer treating tax as something that sits alongside the business or is isolated. They're sort of embedding it within decisions about growth, investment, and overall supply chain design.
Okay, great. And if there's one tax trend that life sciences executives should be paying attention to right now, what would you say that would be?
So I'm going to cheat a little bit on this question. It's not specifically a tax trend, but it involves tax. So for me, the key really is the convergence of tax, trade, and pricing policies. So historically, again, these were separate conversations. The tax team would be worrying about Pillar 2 or transfer pricing, whereas the supply chain team would worry about manufacturing, logistics, and commercial teams would worry about pricing and market access. Whereas today, I think the fascinating thing is that policy across all of those different areas is increasingly pushing businesses towards the same outcome. So take Pillar 2, it reduces some of the historical benefits associated with locating profits in low tax jurisdictions, whereas at the same time, tariff policies are encouraging greater domestic manufacturing in some of the key larger markets. So alongside that as well, we're seeing pricing and market access measures influencing exactly where companies choose to invest and manufacture product. So I think probably for the first time in my career, I would say that those three policy levers are broadly moving in the same direction. So really that's where I think is key to focus. However, it does create opportunity, but it also sort of creates some challenges for businesses. I think the opportunity is that single strategic investments can now solve multiple problems. We've seen a number of large pharmaceutical companies investing heavily in manufacturing and R&D capacity. Those investments can potentially improve supply chain resilience, strengthen substance-based tax positions, which is very important for all of this new legislation. It can support tariff mitigation and generally improve sort of, I don't know if it's the right phrase, but essentially improve the relationships that these organizations will have with policymakers at the same time. The challenge is that organizations can no longer afford to operate in a siloed way and sort of treat these different areas as separate components and not bring them together. So the reason for that is that transfer pricing decisions will almost definitely have some customs consequence. So you're pulling the transfer pricing lever and the customs lever may go in the opposite direction. Similarly, a supply chain decision may have or probably will have pillar two consequences. And a pricing decision may affect sort of the economics that underpin a legacy or existing operating model. So tax, trade, and pricing should be considered as, I think, as one stream, and as the real strategic discussion sits really at sort of the intersection of all three of those areas. So it's a kind of a cheats answer to your question, but I hope that proves insightful.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you. And final one for you, Jim. If you're advising pharmaceutical life sciences companies looking to grow internationally over the next few years, what would be your top priorities in advising them?
Okay, so no particular order, but first I would understand your tax exposure and your tax landscape holistically. It's the word of the month, it seems to be holistically, but many organizations have good understanding of their tax position and a separate understanding of supply chain risks. But I do think far fewer, certainly historically, more so now, or more are now, but far fewer have a joined up view of how tax, tariffs, transfer pricing, customs, and other regulatory developments sort of interact. So I think that's becoming increasingly important. Secondly, I think challenging the robustness of historical operating models is going to be key. Most legacy structures were put in place way before, whether it's BEPS or Pillar Two or US tax reform. Whereas now the current focus should really be on the resilience of your operating model. So I think boards and executives should be asking whether those structures remain fit for purpose, especially in the general direction of travel of the world and of policymakers. And it might be that they're not actually suitable in today's age compared to their original purpose. So that's another area that I'd certainly recommend is high on the agenda. Third, and I'm a tax advisor, so we have to talk about this topic in today's world, but it really is about substance. So the focus on substance. If there is a consistent theme across pretty much every major development we've seen in the last decade across the tax world, it's that governments increasingly expect economic outcomes to align with economic activity. So that's really what's sitting behind all of these policy changes that we have seen over recent years. So whether we're talking transfer pricing, Pillar Two, or broader international tax reform, it's a remarkably consistent direction of travel. So substance matters now more than ever, and I don't think that that's going to sort of reverse or sort of course correct or change course of direction anytime soon. And then I think finally from me, Nigel, I think the last area that I'd focus on is probably transparency. And what I mean by transparency is public reporting requirements are increasing. They're increasing globally. So regulators have access to more data now than ever before. And stakeholders, so investors, are paying much closer attention to tax and to tax positions. So I think that means organizations need structures that are not only sort of technically robust, but also commercially defensible and explainable. And I guess if I had to leave the audience with one thought, sort of generally in this sort of area of tax, it would be this: it's that for much of the last, 10 to 20 years, life sciences and pharmaceutical businesses have asked how to build the most tax efficient global model. Whereas I think the defining question of the next period that we move towards is slightly different. it's really how to build the most resilient global model. And what's interesting is that if you get resilience right, whether that's people, manufacturing, general investment into R&D, supply chains, or governance, the tax outcomes should or increasingly should tend to follow. So that's what I would be advising. That's what I would be advising, or just kind of suggesting are the key priorities for people to consider in the world of tax in this next phase.
Thank you, Jim. So we've come to the end of the panel session. For me, I think just setting it in the context of the global turbulence that we have, the word resilience for me came into everyone's discussion here. And I think that underlies a lot of the issues we have in the industry today and makes planning and getting the advice on these areas even more important because we have to be increasingly resilient. Thank you, panelists. Now we're going to move to questions. Please use the chat, and they're pre-submitted, but please use the chat to submit any other ones. Simon, I've got one for you to kick off with. We haven't really discussed cyber, and so how might the cyber attacks in the industry impact global supply chains, and what can we do to mitigate the risk in this area?
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. I guess that word resilience comes in again. We've seen some really high-profile attacks across multiple sectors, retail and automotive in particular last year, and also some in the life sciences area as well. I think some of the manifestations are quite clear and obvious. So impacts on halting manufacturing, disruption of global drug distribution channels, delaying clinical pipelines. And also, I guess, ultimately causing global shortages, patient harm, arising potentially as a result of that. And in some cases, we're actually seeing governments having to step in to support supply chain, just caused, by the potential, end-to-end halting of production and services. And I think that, the root cause is, as we sort of discussed at the outset, it's that complexity, the level of interconnectedness now across the supply chain, and in particular those third-party dependencies, which are becoming key. I think in terms of ways to try and manage and mitigate the risk, I think the first area is around that operational resilience, and a lot of organisations are now talking about the concept of minimum viable company or minimum viable business, which is really an extension of previous work around sort of business impact analysis, but really identifying and prioritising those critical business processes, understanding them end to end, and I guess acknowledging that you can't, in a cyber attack, restore everything all at once. There's actually a cadence of recovery that needs to take place. You need to prioritize resources, and you also need to understand what the dependencies are in terms of that recovery. And in particular, what we have seen in some of the examples is single points of failure that weren't perhaps understood prior to the attack, but have actually resulted in delays in being able to restore those key operations. So really understanding and mapping out what are your critical business processes, understanding what is your minimum viable company in the context of the supply chain is key. And then testing and exercising that is really important. So, run real world scenarios linked to a cyber attack and really understand where your capability is today. Can you bring those critical business processes online as quickly as possible? And linked to, I guess, the ecosystem and the third-party dependency, it's really understanding the control environment of your third parties. So whether that's through traditional third-party assurance, using more sophisticated scanning activities to understand the security posture of those organizations, because while a failure of a third party may impact your supply chain and the responsibility sits with that third party, you're ultimately accountable when it comes to the delivery of services and drugs. And then probably the third thing I'd probably mention we've seen organizations do is really focus on segmentation of networks and manufacturing environments. So operating on a flat network provides the opportunity for threat actors to move laterally across environments, potentially into those more sensitive OT environments that are responsible for manufacturing, and that can cause the most damage. So really, analysing the network, the kind of the key critical manufacturing environments need to be protected, and building robust defences in place, along with detective capability to be able to manage and respond when there has been a potential breach of those defences.
Thank you, Simon. Another question here, and I think this will be a mixture of economics and sustainability. So giving George and Alice a little second to think about the answer before I throw it at them. Are life sciences supply chains fit for global growth?
Pharmaceutical supply chains are actually, super complex, but pretty robust, right? And they have to be because that's how you effectively manage the pipeline all the way through to the patient. So I don't think it's so much about them themselves being robust, more around the management systems and data collection that is required in order to enable pharmaceutical companies to meet multiple sustainability related regulations in the many jurisdictions they are both manufacturing, they're both procuring from, as well as operating from. And I think it's that complexity that requires really strong management systems to enable compliance with legislation to prevent, risks in terms of fines and litigation, but also to enable confidence from shareholders as well that organizations are able to manage these multiple jurisdictional requirements.
Great. And I will add something from, an economic perspective that I think, are they fit for purpose and for growth? I think the answer on the economic side is you need to do risk assessments of your supply chains and really understand where the pinch points might be, given the turbulence that's going on now. I appreciate that nobody can really predict what's going to happen these days. You don't know what's going to happen from one day to the next. So predicting it is difficult, but I think you have to understand your supply chains in more detail than we used to do so, because things can change overnight at the moment. So no more questions I can see here. So I think thank you, speakers and attendees. It's been great to have you all here. If you haven't yet, please download the full global growing life sciences report. Download that and have a read. It covers some of the issues today, but there are some other issues in there that are well worth looking at. And please get in touch with any of us if you need any help in any of the areas. I hope you found it all valuable today. I certainly have, and I think our panelists have greatly enjoyed being with you today. And thank you for your time.